the month and what's coming up. So I'll take maybe a minute for that. And then, but of course, officially to thank you, Bernie, for coming back in. And we are going to get your own life discussed, and the background has already been discussed. So now we'll get there. But if you can give me a minute, because I don't want to take your time at the end. So whenever you...
It's absolutely fine for you to do it whenever you want to do it. I'm happy.
I tell you, the reason is that I still haven't been able to figure out how do you reach people when there's so many activities happening, because social media posts definitely is not going to be the way. So either people have to figure out that there are ways in social media to keep a track of a person. There's a bell icon on LinkedIn profile and all, because people should make life a little easier for me.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, it's been interesting. Well, when you're, tell me when to stop you, but one of the things that's been interesting about having a book come out now is that in the past, a book tour would have been a few places I might be able to get to. Now, because it's all virtual, I'm going all over the place to do. I did it with you. I did it with Mediate.com this week. We're doing it with, Jackie and I did. We're doing it a number of other places all the time. And it's because I don't have to go anyplace. I just do it from here. It's a whole different experience.
Exactly. I mean, you're reaching out to so many more people. Yeah. And then the fact that it is lying there on YouTube and people are watching it. So it's not lost. That time that you spent is not lost. Otherwise, it would have been one discussion happening somewhere and that's the end. So I think that way, that's as part of that Mediation Vision 2026 is also digital and how to use various aspects. Of course, online mediation is one. How do we use social media to reach out to more people? So all that is also, we should use it properly. So quickly, Bernie, I'll just go through March. I call it edutainment. So it's education and entertainment. So we have, of course, mediated experiences, Hagit from Israel, and then heart, soul, and spirituality, one of the topics to be taken up. So there've been interesting conversations. Okay, Gabriela is doing what? Have you heard of family constellations, systemic constellations? Have you? Okay, that's interesting thing which the Brazilian courts are also using. So she's discussed that, and we're doing it again in April. So this was on International Women's Day, part of again that diversity, equity, inclusion thing. So we had about 25 women from 17 countries to talk about their. I mean, it was still brief because it was about 3 hours and 25 women had said what they had to say. So not too much time for each. So what I started doing was I've started recording them separately also. So this is what I was talking about, that discussion that we had. So you can have a look at that also. Then Anna Sambol for that in Conversation, Beautiful Mind. Then we discussed online mediation. Alberto has done interesting work. Instead, he's been talking about doing things online for the last 20 years, and he's actually worked on things quite for at least 10 years, 12 years. So this was quite interesting that someone out there is saying, look, I'm crazy and you are also crazy. All those things that...
Colin Rule and I did a session on that for the Association of Family Conciliation Courts and online family mediation, and where it's been, where it's going, ups and downs of it, which was interesting.
Okay, this was philosophy, another topic there. So Socrates and mediation, interesting discussion. If you get time, please watch them. Then to begin is from Kyrgyzstan. And then this is what I was saying, that out of those people, now I'm recording them separately. So women and mediation, so Sarah Blake from Australia. We had that discussion. Then we had Mahatma Gandhi and mediation. One more person missing. So this was also interesting discussion. I mean,
really interesting.
And again, that women and mediation. Yesterday we recorded this. Today we are doing
Who is
this.
that again?
That's Andrea O'Neill. I'm a wonderful person in Ireland.
I gotta put a different glasses on. All right, there we go.
And this one we're doing now. And then we are doing with this. I've got a mediation that I did. So he says, look, I'm now your evangelist. So because what I'm saying, high value matters in mediation is something which is still not something that people in India are still talking about. There's still that small matters in the court and everything. So this was something which so we're discussing that. He's going to tell people. This is, I don't know whether you've seen this book, but we are doing, he's just doing a little bit of a workshop also with it. So that, and then the last day of the month, the celebrating mediators, then April, I have this symposium that I'm doing on the topic heart, soul, spirituality, and mediation. Because I mean, you'll hear me saying this a number of times, but I feel this is an area which needs to be discussed, which has not been discussed the way it should have been discussed. Then that in conversation from Kazakhstan. Then again, like I told you, she's doing that systemic constellations. She wants to do an actual thing. So one is, of course, the family thing they do. She's saying we can do on countries also. So I'm getting some mediators from Russia and Ukraine, and let's see how that goes. And then Danny Weinstein, part 3. He's also on part 3. So this is for the symposium. Ken is the keynote speaker. And then 21st April is World Creativity and Innovation Day. So we have a discussion on creativity, innovation, and mediation.
Full month.
Yes. Right now, all the sessions that are going to happen in the symposium, that's not been listed out. There are already about, I think, 7, 8, 10 people already done. More will come in. So there are a lot of sessions which will happen during the month. So that's how it is.
That's great and interesting.
Yeah, and interesting people, interesting conversations.
You have an incredible constellation of stuff. I was just talking to my wife about all the different elements of what you do, and it's very impressive.
But we have to get her into the discussion also at some stage. I mean, in the sense, whatever she wants to talk about in relation to mediation. So that whole movement that she's into, I think we should discuss that whenever she has time.
Well, she's been very much involved in working on the problems with non-disclosure agreements, and has been very concerned about how mediators are often part of that without fully being cognizant of some of the consequences of it. So I'm sure she would be happy to talk about that.
Yeah, let's do that. So, Bunny, now the thing is that basically last time we were at the point when, let's just, of course, not rush it so much also, but your father going back to get your mother. So that was what you were talking about, and then we took it.
But he didn't go back. He had to arrange he was in England. He had to be in England. And I don't remember exactly where we left off. And had to leave my mother and brother behind, because if he didn't leave immediately, he would have been put back in a concentration camp. But he worked, and it was very hard for him to do that. In fact, he tells a story at one point where he had to show his passport, and he left it on a train before he crossed the border, and they went running after him to give it to him, or otherwise, I don't know what would have happened. I wouldn't be here. But and they said some choice things to him, but he always said he thought that was his unconscious ambivalence about going with my brother and mother still stuck there. But he was able to get them to England. I don't really know the whole story about how he did it, but within several weeks they followed.
Perfect. So this is from here. Then what happens after this?
Okay, well, they were in England until the end of 1941, and the Battle of Britain was going on at that point, the warfare and bombing. My brother and mother were evacuated from London, someplace in the south of England, and my brother doesn't remember, and I never did find out the exact place, but I've always wondered since then, because my wife is from the south of England, so I wondered where they were evacuated to. And my father stayed and was part of refugee circles for, I don't know, they were there for maybe almost 2 years in London, in England. And the only thing I really remember from him telling me about that story is he was once at a party with the American singer Paul Robeson, which he was very interested and proud to tell me about. And then they came to the US on a ship that was part of a convoy. And they had a little cloth vest they made that my brother wore at all times. He would have been around 3 years old then, is that right? Yeah. And maybe verging on 4. And he and it said, in case you find me, my grandmother lives, and it had her address in the Bronx in New York City. She was already there because they didn't know what was going to happen, if they would be attacked, if he would be on a lifeboat or anything like that. And in fact, their convoy was under attack from a German submarine. And there was all sorts of things went on to try to evade it or to fight it back, but eventually they sunk the submarine and they made it to North America. I think they landed in Nova Scotia and eventually, or maybe Newfoundland, and eventually made their way down to New York. My aunt wasn't so lucky. She was on a ship, but a couple months, 3 months later, maybe. And the ship was attacked and sunk. And she barely survived, and she was in a lifeboat for 48 hours, and she couldn't swim, and she was very small and not physically strong for a variety of reasons. But she did survive, and she became a social worker in New York City and lived there and worked there for many years. But those were the kind of experiences people are having now trying to escape Ukraine, but that's what happened to them.
But which year is this? Which year did they move there?
It was, let me get this straight. It would have been, they arrived in the US in, I think, the beginning of 1942.
Okay. And what year were you born?
And they lived in New York City with the relatives that were there already. My mother had to go and work because they didn't have any money as a nanny and live in during the week with a family that paid her, and she had to leave my brother, who was young at that time, with relatives with my grandmother in New York and aunts. And she just was working in a different part of New York City during the week. And eventually my father went back to school. He got a degree in social work from what was then called the New York School of Social Work. Later on became the Columbia School of Social Work, where I went many, many years later. And then he and my mother and brother got a job in a residential treatment center for kids called Hawthorne Cedar Knolls, which was part of an agency called the Jewish Board of Guardians. And that was like, in Westchester County, about an hour and a half north of New York City. And they were there, and he was by then had finished his social work training. And so he worked both as a house parent and sort of a therapist for kids there, sort of building on work he'd already done in Germany before he had that formal training. And one thing that happened then was the story was after they had escaped all this stuff, was there was a kid taken in who had a history of a teenager of being an arsonist. And my father was very worried about him being in their unit, but he was forced to take him, and he wasn't in much of a position to bargain about stuff like that. And the kid in the middle of the night did set fire to the place they were in. And there was just one kid who happened to be going to the bathroom who smelled smoke and woke everybody up, and they all barely got out with, again, nothing. But they did survive that. And then he got a job as a director of, I don't know, casework or clinical, of something of that nature, at a residential treatment center in Cleveland, Ohio. Then with a house on the grounds of it, not as house parents. And they moved there in 1944. And and that's where they were living when I was born in March of 1946. And the only other maybe thing to tie the pieces together is his brother, younger brother, who had come to the U.S. a number of years earlier, was drafted as a soldier into the U.S. Army and was in Guam during World War II and died there. He was killed in warfare in Guam. But otherwise, the family made it. That was a big tragedy that doesn't have a happy ending. He was evidently a really wonderful person. He had been working as a union organizer, I think, in New York before he was drafted. And I'm named after him, but my middle name is Simon, which was his name. So that and then I was born in 1946 in March, and then 6 months later he was promoted to be the director of this facility, the resident director it was called, because there was a larger agency it was part of, the Jewish Children's Bureau. We moved into a nice house on the grounds of it when I was 6 months old, and that's where I grew up.
But then again, now when do the actual memories start? That is the point. I mean, right now, this is what you've been told.
My earliest memory, who knows what, my earliest memories that I know when they were on my 3rd birthday.
So we start from there, because everything else you've been told. So now, up till now,
everything else I've been told.
Yes. So now
I'm here. I've arrived on the planet. You
yes,
got me here.
exactly. Finally,
I wonder if I was ever going to be born.
Look, it had to be March. It had to be March. You could not have come in earlier than this. But we should have actually done this on the 12th of March. That is, we should have got you in at that time. But it's okay. Still, we're in March. So then, I mean, when memories start, what you actually, when you look back, what would be the first thing that comes to your mind as to the earliest memory?
My earliest memory is of my parents and my brother at home. He was 8.5 years older than me. He still is, giving me a blue tricycle for my 3rd birthday, and my brother pushing me all over the place on it. But then there's visual memories of Belfair, which I think at some point or other, I gave you some pictures of it. But it is a 32-acre facility. And when I grew up, it looks different now. They've done a lot of stuff that it doesn't matter. But when I grew up, it looked kind of like a boarding school. Lots of woods and fields, baseball fields, a nice gym. I used to play basketball in all the time. And our house, it was a nice brick house that faced this row of sidewalk, on one side of which was a couple living units, cottages they called them, but they were pretty big, that had around 12 or 13 kids living in each one. And these sort of big oak trees on either side, and then looking up the sidewalk to sort of a central area. And it was, so a lot of my memory of that was I lived in this sort of suburban part of Cleveland, Ohio, Cleveland Heights, Shaker Heights area. This was actually called University Heights. And that's a picture of my brother and a friend, Carl Rudman. We went back there for what would have been my father's 100th birthday. And that behind there is a chapel, which is right at the center of it. It was a very nice little building with nice sort of stained glass windows. And it's where I got bar mitzvahed, and a number of people got married there. And you see the living units around the edge there. And over, my brother is a shorter one. Over his right shoulder, if you look at that living unit all the way back there, I worked there for several summers when I was a young adult, in college as a child care worker. But it gives you a sense of it.
Yeah, nice place to grow up. It's a nice place to grow up.
Yeah, it was for me. I mean, a lot of the kids were there and had very troubled backgrounds, and in those years there was this whole concept. That's the house I grew up in, my brother and me, which at that time we partly traveled there because it was his 100th birthday. It was renamed after my father. I think it's called the Fritz Mayer Family Life Center. It's not no one lives there now. It's some offices. Oh yeah, I recognize that. So But it was interesting because there were several interesting things about growing up there, but being within a suburban neighborhood, my family really had no money. And my father made a very minimal salary to begin with. He later on did a little better, but as a social worker. And yet we lived as if we had more money because the house came with the job, and he paid something each month for it, but not what it would have cost. And here and there we lived in this really beautiful surrounding. And then across the street from it was a very wealthy suburb. That wasn't where we actually lived. I lived in a slightly more middle-class one, but Shaker Heights, Ohio, in that time was a very, still is, I guess, parts of it, a very wealthy suburb of Cleveland.
But when you look back, I mean, when do you actually find out that there is something called an affluent neighborhood and we are like this? I mean, this is something that you are now.
Well, when I started going to school, probably when I was in elementary school, first, maybe when I was 8 or 9 years old, I was aware that some of my friends had parents who were wealthy and some had parents who were more working class. And because it was that changing neighborhood at that time. They were all white until I was a little older. Shaker Heights actually became one of the first integrated neighborhoods, intentionally integrated in the years later, in the 50s. But they were all white, and in the particular suburb my elementary school was in, almost not everybody, but almost everybody was Jewish. That changed as time went on dramatically, but that's what it was as I was a young kid, and maybe even as late as high school. There was a very large Jewish population in that school. It was beginning to be integrated, and I was aware that some of my friends had more money than others. Most of them had more money than us, but I wouldn't have felt that way because we lived as if we had more money because we had those circumstances.
No, but how do you, I mean, for a boy that age, how does he find out that they have more money than me? What are those things that you would see as things that money had bought?
Well, some of them had a lot of them just had very simple, suburban 50 style houses, but a few of them had pretty fancy houses. And I know one way I found out. A number of them belonged to country clubs. And we never could begin to think about that. And I remember I was occasionally invited to parties at some of them, or if maybe somebody got married or they got bar mitzvah or whatever. And there was receptions at some of them. And I was aware of the fact that was above our means to go to. That may have been the first way I really.
Yeah, it was
and that's where people play. You're a big golfer, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's where people play golf. And as a kid, my association with golf was that's what the rich people did. Not what people like what we did. And to this day, I've never played a game of golf. So.
Look, in the US, if you don't play the golf, that's like the saddest thing because you have so many golf courses and access is so easy. As I understand, you have municipal courses. And
yes, you do. I just had this imprinted on me when I was young, and I played other things. I played basketball or baseball or whatever, but somehow or other, golf was something beyond my ken. And then I was an adult and I could have played it, but by then I was elsewhere. But it was, biking, skiing, which also is not something for people who have no money downhill skiing anymore, but it was when I started.
No, I was just trying to figure out what are these indicators of wealth at that point of time in life in those years. What was it? I mean, was it having a car was a big thing, or
the kind of car you had? We initially had a car we shared with another family because they didn't have the money for our own car. Actually, it wasn't a family, it was a single woman who worked there, was a psychologist. He was a close friend of the family. And then it was a very simple car. Other people had much more fancy cars, and changed them much more often. We kept the cars until they were no longer drivable. That's something I've done most of my life too. And
but that's
it was
important. I
a
mean,
house.
you're saying
And
that is
how
important.
much they traveled on vacations.
Okay. Because I'm saying every statement of yours is important. When you said that we kept a car for up till we could kind of thing, it's an important statement because that tells you about you, the value system that you came from. It's a value system. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So that's why it's important. Don't miss these things out because these are important.
Well, let me say something about that. I agree with that. And one of the things that I think I grew up with by living on the grounds of Belfair, which was the name of the place, is that everybody, it was, I've written about this, everybody there was a community. It was a community with a purpose. It was, in a sense, an intentional community. It wasn't an egalitarian community. My father ran the show, which in my growing up, but everybody was in it together, and they were there for a purpose. And the purpose was a purpose of helping kids and families. Now, the world has gone on in many ways, and those kind of living arrangements were not treatment arrangements. We have much more trying to put kids in normal and regular families now. That's a whole other discussion. But if you go back to that slide of my brother and another person, Carl Rudman, standing in front of the chapel there in the field. Do you know which one I mean?
Yeah. I'll just open that. Give me a second.
Let me tell you about Carl for just a moment. He's still a friend of mine. He was a kid at Belfair when I was born. He was somebody who it was a child at Belfair who'd had a really rough background. His mother, he never knew who his mother was. Well, he did much later in life, he found her, but he was in a kind of foster home, and the foster parents were very good to him, but he really had a lot of problems. He came to Belfair. He was there as maybe when I was born, he was around 12 or 13 years old. And we're still friends. He later on became a very skilled photographer. He once had a cover of Time magazine. He also was a very skilled, fine cabinet maker. And later he worked for a couple years as a counselor at Belfair as an adult. He has said to me, and I have had contact with him this week. He has said to me that his years at Belfair were the happiest years of his life, which, and he was a kid in one of the cottages there. Now, a lot of other kids wouldn't say that. They would say it was very hard, and I'm sure there was stuff I didn't know about going on that probably was not great. But that's what he would say. And for me, I saw the place through rose-colored glasses. I thought it was just, everybody was getting good treatment and what they needed. And there were some difficult kids, and I saw a lot of shit happen, frankly, but in terms of problematic behavior. I remember one time being with my father walking around the campus. He used to, after services, which were Friday night, he used to go every week around through all the cottages and talk to every people and see people, and people remembered that for years after he retired. That's what they remember, how important that was to him doing it. And I did that with him sometimes. And I do remember on a couple of occasions kids completely losing their big teenage kids losing their temper with him. And I remember people coming over to our house sometimes very upset because a kid had lost it. And one time him going over and taking me with him actually to a place where he had to disarm a adolescent girl who had a knife and was threatening herself and others with it. Something I actually had to do later in my life. But, he did it in a very firm, but I think fundamentally kind way, although he did have a temper, which he lost every once in a while. But but the value that imprinted, I think, on me was a very simple one, that life was about doing good. It was about making a difference. It was about making the world a better place. Now, this comes from being the son of Holocaust survivors too, but it also came from growing up that way. So that the purpose of why we're here is not necessarily to make as much money or gain what we could, and to turn it into material wealth, but to try to do whatever we could to make the world a better place. And many of my friends, most of my friends, their parents were, small business people, or, were, there was some who were professionals. I had a very good friend, his father was a dentist, and but most of them, and there was a sense I had as a kid, and these were good people, and their kids grew up to do wonderful things. Some of them were school teachers, but I did have a sense of the difference between a life where the fundamental measure of how well you did was wealth, versus the fundamental measure of how well you did was how much good you were doing in the world and how much difference you were making. Now, I had talked to a number of other kids who were children of Holocaust survivors there was a similar mixed message. That was one, and the other message was, please don't cause trouble. Don't make us worry about you. We've been enough through. My parents gave that message to me, particularly my mother, very strongly when I got involved in actions that had some risk involved, like in the civil rights movement. She was just desperate and saying, I've been through enough in my life. Don't make me go through this again.
But I'm just thinking
a mixed message about that stuff.
But only thing is that, look, we've gone from you having that first memory maybe at 3 years old, and we moved into elementary school and the onwards. Is there anything in between that we need to find out about? There's something that you missed out in between in terms of growing up? And
no, I think I'm sure memories might be stirred, but that seems like, you got the right idea.
Okay. No, but I'm just thinking the family atmosphere, what's happening with the family, what kind of discussions are you hearing at that point of time?
All right, well, then maybe this is important, that my father had been a leftist in Germany. I think I mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
And he came and he reacquainted himself with leftist circles. Now, this was the early 50s. And a lot of our friends, not the friends I went to school with every day, but a lot of friends who were children of my parents' best friends were also children of people whose parents were leftists. We didn't call ourselves that, but we're sometimes referred to as red diaper babies. And they would have very animated discussions about stuff that I didn't understand as a kid. All I could tell about was they were having very animated discussions. I mean, this was a time of, Stalin had died and the Stalin revelations of some of the awful stuff that had gone on, and people who had been connected with, there was a socialist versus a communist politics that went on in Germany, and it went on the left in the US too. And I do remember that. And it was also the time of McCarthyism in this country. And the Senator Eugene McCarthy started this purge of and inquisition of people who were supposedly communists. Frankly, the Supreme Court hearings in the US where people were where the Jackson, the nominee for the US Supreme Court, was being grilled about critical race theory, and sounded, almost had the feel to me like a similar kind of grilling of people, whether they had any political belief that was not acceptable. Since my father had that leftist background, and in order to become a citizen of the US, he had to say he had to do it, otherwise they wouldn't have survived, that he had never been part of a communist organization. He hadn't, he quit it out of disagreement with them, but he reconnected with that, and with that leftist circle when he was here, but he had to keep it quiet, because if it had been discovered, he very well could have lost his job. I didn't know about this as a really young kid, but I found out about it as an adolescent. So that was going on, and there were a number of parents of friends of mine who were called in front of what was called the House Un-American Activities Committee and grilled about their communist affiliations. And a couple of them were blacklisted and lost their jobs. And some of them my father gave jobs to. One in particular, one guy was in jail for a couple of years. Or a friend of mine's parents were in jail sequentially so they could take turns raising her. And he gave them jobs after they got out, where they couldn't get jobs anywhere. So he took some risks, and he was never outed about that.
But that means, but in American society at that point of time, communism, socialism, leftism were not at all discussed, or were not supposed to be discussed. Was the society kept away from those principles or thought processes at all? Totally?
Not totally. If you were in the McCarthy era, if you were openly a communist, and there were people who were, you were very vulnerable. My parents weren't exactly communists, although I think they flirted in and out of that circle. They were socialists. And there was a lot of discussion of that. And it wasn't shut down. It just was, if you were in a government job, you would lose it. And there were a lot of people who were blacklisted from organizations. It could make your employment much more difficult, but particularly if you had a communist affiliation. And in this day and age, it's hard to understand what that meant. It wasn't like, at least the people I knew, for supporting dictatorship or authoritarianism, or it was people in the 30s, 1930s, 1920s and 1930s. If they were interested in social change and in dealing with the wealth gaps and so forth, they would naturally, and with racism and with colonialism, they would, for the most part, flirt with different leftist groups. I'm sure that was true in India too. I know there was a large communist party in India's history, for example. It didn't quite mean the same thing then. Later on, particularly, I don't know how much I want to get into this, but particularly after the time that Russia signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler before the outbreak of World War II, it started to mean something different, because it started to mean you supported Russia no matter what the hell it did if you were a communist, rather than critique it. And that's when my parents really moved away from any affiliation with that. My mother never was, but my father in particular. But then after the war was over, some people drifted back into it, and my father flirted with that. But then when Russia invaded Hungary, he left for good, and he became in some ways somewhat conservative even in his older years. So it wasn't not discussed, and I certainly knew people who openly discussed it. But depending on your job or your circumstances, you could be very vulnerable, and then there were some violence against communists too. So.
Yeah, because what I'm looking at is, why I'm asking you this is because, one, in the house there is some discussion. You see your father having, I don't know how much you're picking up from there. I mean, that something is going into the subconscious, and you're not, obviously something which you can't maybe really talk about it. Okay, at that point of time I understood this, but something in the subconscious is happening, and there's a world outside where this is not looked upon as a good thing to be discussing. So in that sense, is there some, I mean, conflict or some thought process on this coming to you?
Well, it was discussed in my family, and the older I got, the more my father told me. And what my father didn't tell me, my older brother told me. So, and he's still very involved in he's written books on analytical Marxism. He's never belonged to any Party or anything like that. And he's never approved of Stalinism, but he kept me informed. And I then, as I got older and more politically aware myself, would talk with my friends about it, and we would have arguments, and some of them don't know what the hell I was talking about. They were much more focused on my support for civil rights, which some of them gave me an incredibly hard time about, and others did not. So, you know, it's not true that it wasn't talked about. It was talked about. Saying that you supported or belonged to the Communist Party wasn't something you said very freely, and we didn't, and I certainly didn't. But it was talked about. And as a teenager, as early as 13 or 14, there were all these demonstrations against nuclear weapons that I started participating in with older friends, family friends, and other people. And I remember early on talking a lot about the situation of African Americans and supporting the civil rights movement. I can remember when Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for sitting in the front of a bus in 1956. I was 10 years old then. I remember that pretty well, and we talked about it. And then gradually there was demonstrations in support of that too, of the civil rights movement too. And when I was in high school, I belonged to two groups. One was the Student Peace Union, which was an anti-nuclear weapons and anti-war group. And I belonged to a group called SCORE, actually, Student Corps, the Student Congress of Racial Equality. The Congress of Racial Equality was a major civil rights organization that I eventually got extremely active with in my late teens, and that's another story. So I gradually started doing stuff like that with more or less the approval of my parents. They were supportive of that, but there was that other message of just, don't do anything to make us worry about your safety. And later on, I did do stuff to worry about my safety.
No, because the thing is that socialism, all those discussions are things which, I mean, on whatever you look at around in society, the disparity in terms of wealth, and of course, I mean, that's the basic thing that we would look at when, as a young person, also you're looking at it around you, and definitely you would question those things. So the theory behind it does support a better concept of looking at society. I'm sure it does, but then whether the capitalistic society that you are then part of, and how do you match those values that you bring in and you merge with that society? Is there something happening there in terms of conflicts or?
I mean, we talked about it at that level, and I remember from ages of 15 on or something, reading books that critiqued American class society, like C. Wright Mills, for example, is a sociologist who wrote books called, The Power Elite and White Collar. And I remember reading some of those and talking about them quite a bit with my parents and my brother and others. And so there was that out there. There were people who openly talked about Marxism in particular, and how and there were a lot of people who were active in trying to work in labor unions, but they were purged too. American labor unions were purged during the McCarthy era of communists, and they've never been quite the same since they became more and more just about getting more and more benefits for their own members and not looking at the real class nature of the society and the problems that was creating. So we talked about that. This was so you have to understand there's two sets of friends I'm talking about. They're the friends whose parents also grew up there, who came to that on their own. And they're the friends I went to school with and played basketball with and went to parties with. And they overlapped, but there were a lot of differences. And a lot of my my friends who I had my more day-to-day relationships with. But I was like from Mars when I would start talking about stuff like this.
Tell me,
They didn't
tell me,
get it.
this picture that I have, this is you at what age is this, you said?
I would have been around 10. That's in my bedroom reading comic books.
So, because this is the young boy who we're talking about, who's,
Yeah,
of course. But in terms of friends, I mean, is there a diverse group of friends? I mean, or is it
diverse
because?
is not how I would describe them, except politically. It was a very white, primarily Jewish community. I didn't, I'll tell you what was diverse. Belfair was diverse. Belfair had a diverse staff, and it also, as increasingly as I grow up, it had a diverse population of kids, increasingly non-sectarian. It became that was one of the things my father did. And it was viewed by some neighbors as that place where there were a lot of African Americans working, and I grew up with I grew up with a lot of them as staff all around me, and I became, as I got older and started doing more work there, some of them became friends, some of them still are, and I do remember a number of times people reflecting, I think what their parents said something about, oh, I know that's a place where you have all those blacks working, except they use other words. And that was a bit of a shock. But I also saw that as a challenge and let people have it back on that. I wasn't always very diplomatic. Some people would say I'm still not. But
how do you handle this? I mean, there is a world outside that definitely there is a lot of discrimination, but within Belfort there is no. I mean, there's no discrimination as such. Everyone is doing their work, and the black and the
I
aspect is not.
suspect there was discrimination, and I know there was discrimination in there. That the top leadership was white and mostly Jewish, and the lower you got in terms of the hierarchy of the organizational structure, the more people were likely to be African Americans. But my father did promote a lot to higher levels. But when you got to the level of people who cleaned the buildings, there were maintenance people, they're almost all black. So it was certainly a hierarchy there. The other thing, of course, I told you I was active in the civil rights movement, and that's starting from the age of 15 or 16 on. And then that introduced me to a whole diverse group of people who, in some ways, certainly were equals. In some ways, I thought as leaders of, and people I felt like they were the ones I looked up to as more knowledgeable and capable, and so that led me to a whole different kind of participation and diversity. But growing up until I was a late teenager, virtually all my peers in school and were white and mostly Jewish.
But you could, I mean, in that sense, you could sense some kind of discrimination, but nothing that you could do anything about, or you. I mean,
I didn't have the idea of what you did about it quite until I was a little older. I saw the movement built, and I became active in it as soon as I possibly could. My mother, when I was the age of 6 or 7, started working as a social worker in adoption and foster care agency, public agency in Cleveland, and that entered a whole new set of friends. Of her, a lot of her colleagues and were diverse, and my parents' personal friends. There was a lot of diversity of people who came and into our house and had dinner with us and hung out with us. And she always told me the story at one point when I was quite a young kid, maybe the age of that kid in that picture, maybe younger, going to visit a colleague of hers who was African American and who lived because it was a very segregated city at that time, in a much poorer community. and in a very rundown building in a rundown neighborhood, and taking me into her apartment. And the apartment was beautifully taken care of, very nice furnishings. And I remember looking out the window and looking at her apartment, and with all the tact of a little kid saying, how comes this apartment is so pretty, and the area and the building is so, not so run down or something. And my mother was very embarrassed, but the woman thought I was being really honest, and laughed a lot. So that's a story I remember hearing told about that. It was all around us. But in suburban life was also, it was like a little oasis of, you were kept that away, and the message of in a lot of families and a lot of friends, and in a lot of my teachers too, was, don't go down there, don't let that into here. So I'll tell you, I remember a story when I was starting to be active in the civil rights movement. There was a guy who had run a newspaper in Mississippi during some of the harshest moments of the civil rights movement. I forget the name of the newspaper now. And he was coming up to speak about his experiences when I was in high school. And he was going to speak at a playhouse called the Karamu Playhouse. It was in a African-American neighborhood. It was a great playhouse. It had kind of an international reputation for kind of community theater. And I used to go there a lot. I wanted to put up there were announcements put up on that loudspeaker each morning about events. And I wanted to say that anybody put up an announcement that said anybody who was interested in going to hear this guy speaking, he was speaking whenever. And I was called into the assistant principal's office, and I was told, we don't want our kids going down there. We're not going to put this up. Because even though it was you can imagine, it was a very respected place, but it was in an African-American neighborhood. So that was a kind of world, and I was becoming more and more aware of it and more furious about it as I got older and more involved in understanding the world politically. One thing I came to realize when I started driving was we lived in a suburb. I lived at this place I've described that was primarily white in those years. And I would drive down to downtown Cleveland usually for meetings of one kind or another. And you would drive from downtown Cleveland along Lake Erie, right across the lake from where I live now. And then you would go through this little parkway, and you'd go through this university area, and then you would go up this hill, and you were in the suburbs. All that drive, you were surrounded by African-American neighborhoods on the east side of Cleveland. And a lot of them were very poor, and a lot of them were very run down. And you would go that whole drive, and you wouldn't see one of them because of how it was created. But if you went a block and a half off, you were in a whole different kind of neighborhood. And I later on saw similar kinds of things when I traveled the country. I remember seeing, I don't know if you've ever been to Cape Town in South Africa, but it had a similar feel where you could go from very beautiful beach areas to very nice neighborhoods, and you'd have all these really poor rundown areas all around you. I was there after the end of apartheid, but it was still there. I think that wasn't uncommon, but I remember realizing that and thinking, my God, we are trying to give people a sense there's none of that in the world.
But in terms of your attitude towards the young kids, African American friends or whatever, it's not a patronizing kind of attitude.
I hope not.
I don't know. Sure, if you look back,
I must have had implicit bias, just like most of us do, but I hope not, and I certainly don't remember thinking that. But I do think it was easy to feel like if you're having an African-American friends over to your house, you're showing how liberal you are, and rather than there is implicit bias that liberals had that, I can remember. And
but there is a
being slapped upside the, being confronted periodically about a few things for that to, I still think we need that. I think everybody, needs to be people who come from my background need to periodically be reminded of how you might grow up with attitudes that despite your values and really not wanting that they express themselves sometimes. And I think our obligation is to take that openly and to non-defensively, and to see it as a gift when somebody takes the energy and the emotional risk sometimes of saying, wait a second, I can remember stories of stuff like that I hope I dealt with well. I'm sure I sometimes have dealt with better than others. I remember also I'll tell you this one other story. When I graduated from high school, it was in January, which was unusual, but there's a story to that. And I didn't start university until the following September. And during that time, I worked very much it was very involved in the civil rights movement. I got arrested. There are a lot of stories about that. But I also worked in a factory that made kind of glue and fix-it products, the Wood Hill Chemical Company. And it was a very segregated faculty, a facility. I worked in a part where I was the one white person and everybody else was black. And the next department over, which was an open space, but it was just a different area, were almost all people who were from a Eastern European background. And the racial tension in there, which I remember getting caught at in the middle of a couple of times, was intense. And then when I was meanwhile doing stuff in the civil rights movement, and at one point I got arrested in a demonstration and there was a lot of publicity about it. I think that went running through that factory in a lot of interesting ways. And anyhow, you saw that stuff all around, but in the day-to-day life growing up, there was a real effort to insulate people from it. And I sometimes was the agent as I got older with my friends of saying, guess what's going on? Some of my friends really changed and some of them became activists themselves, but a number of others just thought I was doing something that was not okay.
But was there, in that sense, also a class system that you had the African Americans, Eastern Europeans, I don't know whether Hispanics were also there. I mean, was there a categorization there in terms of hierarchy?
Oh, well, yes. In the plant you're talking about that I worked in, I think that there was tension between them. I think they all were exploited and paid very poor wages and, lived much less. The owners were very wealthy, and these people were not. There was a lot of tension between the groups, but I think in some ways it was a classic example of how capitalism divides and conquers.
Exactly. Yeah.
And colonialism divides and conquers. Yeah. And I don't remember Hispanics in that particular factory. They were sort of in a different part of the county. We were more eastern Cleveland. If you moved to the west of the county, there was a significant Puerto Rican population in towns west of Cleveland. And some in the auto industry, which was there. So there was definitely class stuff. And they were divided the way they are throughout U.S. society, continue to this day. I mean, I think all of the critical race theory stuff in the U.S. and all the attacks on trying to disempower African American voters is in if you push deeply into what it is to keep white working class people and people of color who are working class divided and not seeing their common interests really.
But that's, yeah, we have to have a discussion on that decolonization thing, because that definitely is a whole discussion by itself, the divide and rule, like you said. But I'm just thinking in terms of the work allocated in terms of groups, was that based on certain, like I said, black?
Well, I don't know how they naturally, I really don't know, I don't remember anyhow, how they naturally got into different departments. I suspect when they applied for jobs, they were assigned there because just to keep the peace. So the department I was in was much more involved in making packaging material and preparing things for shipping and running the warehouse part of it. And the other parts were actually the people who were filling the tubes and stirring up the chemicals to make the glue. Really, they were right next to each other. It wasn't that huge a factory, but they were completely different. And I remember there were a few people who were transitional, and they were sort of the higher skilled ones. Like there was people who were mechanics who knew how to fix all the machinery, for example, who I work with. There was one black guy, I still remember his name was Mayo, and there was a white guy who was from Alabama, and they were the two mechanics, and they went back and forth, and I became friends with all of them. And at one point, I was working on a machine, and I don't want to get into the details of what it was, where you worked on one kind of product and then you changed it. It was, if you think of a tube of glue or something in a warehouse with a little plastic, hard plastic, but see-through cover over it, that's what I was making. We called them blisters. And you would make one kind, and then when you had filled up all the storage for that, you'd switch to a different kind, and that involved taking off molds and plates, and it took a couple hours to retool it. And I'd figured out a way we could store stuff a little more efficiently, so you didn't have to do that. And why did I figure that out? It's because I was bored. I was trying to figure out how to make things work better. It was a pretty boring job. And so we started doing that. And the department I was in that put it into the storage, which involved a slightly different way of stacking things, was black. And the department that took it down was white. And they complained that it was harder to take it down. And I remember this black mechanic just losing it and starting shouting at them, said, "It's not, this is ridiculous. It saves all sorts of problems." He went up there and he showed them how easy it was. And they started shouting at each other. And I was just watching. And I was pulled aside then by one of the owners of or managers, the upper hierarchies of the group. And he said, "Thanks for what you were trying to do. Don't do it again." It was ridiculous, but it became symbolic of the tension between those.
But how old are you at that point in time?
18.
Okay. But you have to take us through, what were you reading all throughout? I mean, besides those comic books that you were telling us about, what else are you reading at this stage and earlier than this?
Well, I remember the first books that I really got totally entranced by as a kid were the Black Stallion books by Walter Farley, which were a series of books about a kid. It doesn't matter what they're about. And I remember reading all the Hardy Boy books. So those were not political unless you unpack the world they were portraying. But the first, I can remember my parents read, my mother in particular was an avid reader of The Nation, which was a publication that still exists, I think a weekly magazine, that I remember starting, it was always lying around the house. I remember started reading to some of that. And that became some of the reading that my parents and I would talk about, of of the world from a more liberal, left liberal, not socialist point of view. You know, I started reading, I think I mentioned some of the books by C. Wright Mills was an earlier one that I read that was much more political. I was 13 when the Cuban Revolution happened, and he wrote a book called Listen, Yankee, that talked about the Cuban Revolution because of American imperialism that led to it. That was later on. There were other problems with the Castro regime, but I remember reading that and that opening my eyes and becoming enamored in some ways with the idea that this was a revolution that happened in Cuba when I was 13 years old, and thinking this was really a model for what might happen in the future, and also starting to read more about the history of Russia, of China, and again thinking, well, this revolutions really were about changing, and maybe they did something really good. And it wasn't so much older that I realized some of the problems that went around along with that model. So I remember reading stuff about that. There was a book, I can't remember the author right now, called The Ugly American, that was one of the earliest books before the Vietnam War, but setting the stage of what American foreign policy was perceived of as perpetuating a class war. And
so these are the kind of, I mean, but
most of the books I read were crap novels that kids like.
No, but I'm just thinking all these books that you're talking about, that mean because they were lying around, that's why you picked them up, or you really?
Because I'd heard about them from other people who said you should read them. And it was not, I can't remember even my parents or my brother at that age pointing me towards any of that. Later on, I started studying some of that stuff much more seriously.
But are you developing your own theories about revolutions and class distinctions and all? I mean, are you doing something there?
Yeah, I think it's starting from the age of 12 or 13, I began to think that the racism and segregation in particular, and the ways in which we were developing the weaponry that could end our species was not a good thing. The other thing, this is not on, we had all these records from leftists in the house. So I remember hearing one of them was an album called The Talking Union, which was put out by the Almanac Singers, who later on, some of them became the Weavers, who were Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and Millard Lampell, and so hearing all these Union songs, I grew up knowing Union songs, and the earliest and songs of and Paul Robeson, who I mentioned earlier, who was a Black singer who sang songs about racism and about working class and about unionism and about and he was a socialist. I'm sure he was a communist at some point, and he had a whole history of being red baited out of the country and forced to leave. But he was a very respected, beautiful singer we had a lot of his records around. And I listened to a lot of that as a kid. And I listened to I remember getting an early record of the Weavers when I turned 12. And that again were all these leftist singers. A lot of them were just folk songs, but some of them were political songs too. So to this day, I know all sorts of Union songs and songs of the Spanish Civil War. I remember that, and songs of certainly of the Civil Rights Movement. That came a little later. So that was actually very important to my developing political sense of the world or understanding of the world, but in a child's way. And it was just music, but it was,
Oh, music is strong. Music is powerful.
Very strong.
No, but have you found some friends whom you have these discussions with? have you?
Yeah, there were definitely some friends I had, and some friends who I argued with, and some friends who were gradually coming around. Some friends whose parents were also like that. So, and a couple of the friends whose parents were lefties, they lived at Belfair because my father hired their parents when they couldn't get jobs anywhere else, and we were still are in contact with each other.
That's not bad. Yeah, you actually, but this is like, I mean, kind of meeting them, or was just some communication otherwise? I mean, would you?
Well, a lot of it's electronic, but a couple of them I still see whenever I can. We don't live in the same part of the world, but
I'm just thinking that if you do sit together, what would you discuss? I mean, that's what I was just thinking.
At that age or now?
Now.
Now we talk about what's going on in the world now. I mean, occasionally there may be reminiscent stuff, but two of my oldest friends I talk to every week. They were part of that world, and a couple of them have become lifelong activists, mostly anti-war, but also environmental activists. And we talk about that, but a lot of it's just about life, like you would talk to with any good friend.
No, I'm just thinking
trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. It's as a kid you're trying to, and I'm still trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah. It's pretty scary.
I'm just thinking that you had certain thoughts at that point of time, and how you saw society developing around you, and what things that you thought went wrong or what went right. So, I mean, looking back, do you do all that, or is just that take it as it is?
I all of the above. We certainly have gone back. Look, how do we understand things now? How do we understand it now? I'm going to have to leave in
okay. So basically, we end at your high school. We end there this time.
I have to take another 5 minutes. I just wanted to.
Yeah. Okay. So because we've of course reached high school quite fast, we should have spent a little more time before that, but it's okay. So okay. So what you can do is maybe looking at, say, getting out of high school up till then. If you look back, do you want to just some kind of a conclusion as to what you think you picked up from there and how it's helped you?
A very normal, white Jewish kids, middle-class kids, suburban lifestyle. And I also was involved in stuff that none of my friends around me were. I lived in a residential treatment center. It's not how the rest of them lived. They would come there because I had access to their gym, and we would play basketball there or baseball there. But otherwise, there was that difference. And then there was the political stuff that I was getting very involved in at a fairly early age, in the peace movement and the civil rights movement. And that was very different. That was a whole different crew. So there was part of me that grew up very normally, and part of me that was very different from the people around me. And I guess I like the normality and I like the difference.
But if you look back and you say, what did you really,
my identity.
But what did you really pick up from that time, which you think has been useful to you right in later in life? Any few things that you want to pick up from there?
Well, I certainly gradually learned an awful lot around the world at the table I sat at. I learned, I think I said, about life being about making a difference. I learned about trying to make a difference, the kind of tension, but the importance of trying to make a difference on an individual level, and trying to make, with the people you work with and try to help, and and trying to make a difference on a systemic level. And I began to learn about class differences as well, and racial differences. And so to this day, I think that as a person in mediation and in the conflict world, I think very much about what do you help people in their present situation and how you see it set within the systemic framework they're working within. And those are pretty important lessons.
What we have to do is
also about diversity and how important it is, and how privileged I was, even though my family had been through a hell, I did grow up with a sense that I was pretty privileged.
Because what we have to do is we have to explore. We haven't explored your relationship with your brother, and of course with your father and your mother. That we haven't explored. So we'll basically maybe explore that, and then we'll move into you getting into college and what happened there. So let's do
Okay.
that. Yeah. So perfect. So thank you very much, Bernie. It's
thank you
okay. It's
for
going to be. I told you it's going to be a slow process. So no
It'll
hurry.
take time. I'll be gone for most of May, so maybe the next time will have to be after.
Yeah, we'll just fix that up. I'll stop this live stream and then maybe I'll see what dates you have.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And for up till the next time.